So I wanted to do a deep dive for a remaster of Blackened for a few reasons. Firstly, because the sound of the And Justice for All record is notoriously divisive, and secondly, because this is a rare instance of usable stems being publicly available on the internet. For a lot of my work on YouTube, I have to use stem splitters, which means they generally involve some pretty out there techniques and workflows, which don't apply to common mixing practices. But on this one, even though the stems are already quite heavily processed, this was more of a straight up remix job, which is probably more useful for a general audience to see. I also wanted to dive a little bit into why I believe the original actually needs fixing, and as some people have asked, why it's not practical to just boost the bass up a little bit and leave everything else as it is. I'm working with studio monitors that I trust, a well-treated room, and monitoring headphones. I could be patronising here like every other YouTube audio guru and say something like you don't need expensive gear or ears over gear, but there's a reason they all say that while the room behind them is full of $5,000 compressors and tape machines. The reality is, it helps. But with that being said, the most important thing above all else is that you trust your monitors. If you don't know how to make sure of that or what that means, there's plenty of great articles out there on your preferred search engine. For this, I'm working entirely in the box, simply because it will be easier to follow and for everyone to see exactly what I'm doing and why. No matter how many times you've heard the song before, we have to get our listening ears on and drill into what needs fixing. It's also important to start with a totally clean slate. If you start a project with an idea of what you want to do already set in your head, you're going to end up fighting the track trying to make it do what you want instead of giving it what it needs, which should always be the goal. Here's a quick example of how I generally go about the critical listening process. Okay, let's isolate that squealing at 2.5 to 3K. Okay, so because the guitars are the only prominent thing in the intro, this has to be dealt with. Once we get past the intro, we're still going to dial it back, but we're going to want to leave some of it in there because as bad as it sounds on its own, it's going to be helping a lot with the aggression of the guitars in the main mix. Cool, I'll listen to the rest of the track now, doing the same sorts of things, and report my findings.
Yeah! Go on with Blackened! Blackened!
Okay, here we go. That snare is iffy. It cuts through great, but is missing something or doing too much of something else. There is no bass. The bass is absent, it is in the ether, it is non-corporeal, it is simply not there. The kick is wide, it is a big boy. It sounds like the kick and snare were recorded on separate planets in different ages of the universe, let alone with separate mics in different rooms. The vocals are possibly a bit low, but that's fine because the enunciation is clear and everything can be understood perfectly fine. The soundstage is good. It's tinny. There's a severe lack of lower mid-range and we need some warmth. You can see they did try to combat this with the guitars. As you can see, there's plenty of data there, but the way the brain processes this particular tone is by focusing almost entirely on that amp hiss and high end, which is another reason why we need to dial it back. And it's undercompressed. Yes, there's plenty of clarity and the dynamics are fantastic on paper, but we need some glue here. Not a lot, but we need some. So we've got the original up here for reference, which is being routed directly to the stereo output, and then we've got the stems, which I've routed purely based on my own personal workflow. As long as you've got the stems routed to the mix bus and the mix bus routed to the master bus, you're golden. Any sends or effects I've added, I route directly to the master bus, not the mix bus. Again, this is based on my workflow and generally how I get results. Also, the order I break the tracks and effects processing down is not necessarily the order in which I mix them. I'm always going backwards and forwards, making adjustments based on how the other stems currently sound. So most of these stems are mono, which means I've lost some width in the kick. So we're putting it back in here with a pretty hefty side boost around the fundamental. Then we're just dealing with some boxiness which could get in the way of the other instruments and taking a bit of click out of the beta. Across pretty much everything, I always high pass around here if I remember to. To be clear, you don't have to do this if you really don't want to, it's just something that I'm neurotic about. You don't want those frequencies building up and causing problems with bad quality speakers on playback. Just adding a tiny bit of attack here as we've lost a bit of cut through by dialing the beta back. This is where we begin adding the warmth to that low mid range by creating some additional harmonics. I usually use Waves R-Bass for this, but Bark of Dog just sounded better on this particular take. Cool, so we've got a 2.5 dB boost around 2.5k here. Remember earlier that we decided that we needed to nuke that frequency range on the guitars, so we can help to keep the aggression and balance of the track by adding some here instead. Plus it's a warmer area for the snare transient to cut through, which will also help us deal with its hint. Again, a small attack boost, but this time with a sustained drop. The snare mic on this stem is picking up a lot of hi-hat, and I wanted to drop that a bit. The sustain dial here is basically working as an upwards compression or expansion. No work needed on the overheads at all, they sound fantastic just as they are. Yeah, as you can see, the gain on this is minuscule, it's just barely tickling the audible spectrum to help make the drums a more cohesive unit. So the drums needed a bit of glue to place them in the same space, but they're also massively lacking in aggression, particularly for this style of music. You can't do better than this specific compressor for this job. We're not going to go too heavy-handed, just enough is always enough. Also helping with the aggression is the Aphex Vintage Exciter. It's not doing a lot, you don't really want to overdo this sort of thing. Again, just enough to give some warmth to the transients. And finally, the Pultec. We're doing a bit of tube saturation here, creating some more harmonics to put all the drums in the same space, as well as a little low-end boost at 30 to help build towards that overall track warmth that we targeted during the critical listening phase. Okay, let's take a listen to the bass intro first. I mean, that is some bassline, but in terms of how it sounds, I can almost see why they made it barely audible in the original mix. Let's crank it up and listen to it in the context of everything else. Yeah, it's blooming pretty hard, and the string noise is a huge detractor from the cohesion of everything else. And this is why in this scenario we can't just bump up the volume and hope for the best. Generally this is a mix bus compressor, but I wanted something grippy and relatively transparent to catch the string transients and bring the actual tone forwards a few notches. I do love this bass tone, but sadly we now need to absolutely massacre the top end so that it won't bother the guitars. More tone work, creating additional harmonics to help the bass come through on smaller speakers. This also gives us a couple of dBs of gain, so we need to keep an eye on that. Cool, here's where we start getting the stems to work with one another. I've got a sidechain set up here from the kick drum, which is ducking the kick fundamental from the bass, so that they don't get in each other's way. And a second instance of Soothe 2 at a very low mix value, this time dealing with the remaining string noise that was still getting through and compromising the rest of the mix. So just on the left channel, I've got some dynamic EQ going, dealing with some particularly pesky frequencies that were only present on this side of the double track. So these aren't really overdubs, it's just what the stems were called. They are the rhythm guitars present during the solo, and they needed some additional ducking to allow the solo to cut through a bit better, so we're dealing with the bloomy low end as well as some of the amp hiss and string noise up top. We've got a nice little boost at 500, just above the range that the bass occupies. I also wanted a bit more juice on the sides where the bass won't be present, so we gave it a little bump at 150. Because we're going to remove a lot of 2.5 to 3K, we needed to replace that aggression with something else. I've got the black box dialed to add some minor distortion harmonics a bit lower in the spectrum, and this should achieve this pretty effectively. This also aligns with our goal of warming the track up a bit. Now the black box is fantastic, but one of the downsides is that it does tend to increase the width of the stereo image slightly, which isn't necessarily something that we want at this point. Now we could control this with the stereo width knob, but I'm not a huge fan of digital stereo widening or reduction, so instead let's keep an eye on it and keep moving. We can always fix it later if it does become a problem. So this is where I did most of the meat of the dynamic EQ processing that we talked about in the intro. It's automated so that the cuts are larger during the intro and parts of the song where the guitars are more isolated, but much smaller when everything else is playing together, so that they still have enough presence to form the aggressive Metallica sound. And to finish off the guitars, I actually low-resed them a little bit. The stems were just a bit too shiny when compared to the original, and it's always important to maintain a level of reverence for the artist's intentions wherever you think it's necessary. The Wunderlich is actually a compressor/tone box, but we don't actually have any of that activated here, just the travel dial, which emulates an aged unit. So the vocal stems are really good, I just needed to deal with the top end a little bit. The original record is just too harsh on the top end across everything, and the vocals are fairly symptomatic of that. I also took the opportunity to build on the goal of warmth by bumping it around 500k.
Is the end, winter it will send, throwing all you see into obscurity. Death of Mother Earth, never a rebirth. Evolution's end, never will it mend, never.
This is another one of those situations where the take sounds better isolated prior to processing, but in the context of the mix, the adjustments are definitely necessary. You've probably noticed all the instances of NLS channel across the mix. Essentially what these do is emulate analog console summing and the macro differences between each channel. Choosing different desks for each track depending on which sounds more effective can be a great way to create instrument separation and give each track its own space to live in. This is not the best summing plugin out there, that would have to be Universal Audio's Neve or API summing, but as far as I know it only works natively in Luna, and this one still sounds great and does what it needs to do. Aside from the dynamic EQ on the guitars, there's only some minor volume and pan automation going on during the solo, just to make sure that the post-solo section has enough oomph and that the guitar solo is positioned correctly in the stereo image according to the original. So here's the final piece of the NLS puzzle. This is adding a tiny bit of console saturation and aiding the overall warmth. So the Unfair Child is essentially doing the same thing as the NLS bus. We're adding some more analog saturation here, and personally the Fairchild is my favourite flavour. Also important to add that zero compression is being done here at all, it's all turned off, this is just here for the colour. Firemaster is a fantastic colour box for creating space, I use it across almost everything I do. Essentially I just lower the default settings and then duck the mix knob down to a level that sounds good based on that particular track. And yeah, no compression on the mix bus. I didn't think it was needed at this stage, and it can always be added in mastering, which we'll get onto now. So a lot of people tend to forget that the goal of mastering is to make a song broadcast ready. You can absolutely use it as an opportunity to tweak the sound, just try not to take your eyes off the ball while doing so. So all we're doing here is a tiny bit of compression to control the peaks of the snare and the hi-hat, which was a big problem with the original mix, and it was starting to become quite prominent here as well. Yeah, a bit of Golfos, helpful here because we overdid the warmth ever so slightly, and rather than going back and adjusting everything, I'm more than content to let Golfos do all the work here. Plus, if this was an actual mastering job, we wouldn't have the stems available to do that anyway. Yes, I'm using a stock Logic plugin, and yes, that is perfectly fine. All we're doing with it is boosting some of the upper mid-range to get some aggression back, as well as a little bit on the sub-bass to taste. Now, I don't like using SSL bus compressors on metal. I tend to find it overkill when you have all these transients coming at you at lightning speed. However, in this instance, everything was just sounding a bit too loose to me. And as you can see, it's at a very low ratio and a very low level in parallel. It's just doing enough to make sure all the instruments are acting as a unit and absolutely nothing more. Who doesn't love a good tape machine? This one is at default settings, partly because the GUI is currently broken and doesn't work on the latest version of macOS, but it still sounds just fine. And finally, we're driving everything into the limiter. I usually aim for 9 lifts with rock and metal, but always making sure that we aren't living in gain reduction. We do have a little bit of XL going on here as well, just to fatten everything up. And that's the mix. If you've somehow stumbled upon this without hearing the whole mix, it's on my channel, so go check that out now. And in other channel news, as some of you have asked, once I get everything up and running, I will be starting a Patreon, which will include full album remasters, lossless audio downloads, exclusive mix breakdowns, and all the good stuff. Stay tuned for more info on that, hopefully in the near future. One thing, however, that I will never ever sell is presets. If you use a preset and it sounds great, that's absolutely fine, that's what they're there for. But downloading a content creator's pack of presets who promises you that they will fix your mixes overnight is absolutely catastrophic for your progression as an engineer. You have to learn why your tools work for you, not how and why they work for someone else. So yeah, when I launch the Patreon depends entirely on you guys. I want to have a solid subscriber base and back catalogue before I do that, so that it's worth your valuable time visiting and handing over all your hard-earned cash. So make sure you subscribe, tell your friends or favourite forums, and we can get this whole thing off the ground a bit quicker. Cheers!